the final episode of Zero Input Agriculture, Season 1. And before you get too excited, Season 2 will be back, but the show will be rebranded as Recombination Nation. So, thoughts behind the name for the relaunch? Recombination is a specific biological term where similar chromosomes swap part of their DNA in a kind of coordinated dance. And it's one of the superpowers that makes sexual reproduction so effective at supercharging evolution. And more generally, it can also refer to any horizontally transferred chunk of DNA through whatever mechanism, though that's the less common use. And the reason why I decided to do this rebrand is because the scope of my work is broadening to include not just agriculture, but culture as well. And this is mostly driven by my belief that biology and human culture are the two truly renewable resources that we have at our disposal to keep us going after the industrial era comes and goes. And nation kind of speaks to that idea of culture. I see a nation as a group of people, or maybe other organisms, if you want to broaden your scope, that have a similar operating system with which they tackle the world. Intentions for the work going forward is to focus on all sorts of biological and cultural experimentation, hybridization, syncretism, cross-pollination, borrowing ideas, and putting boots on the ground and actually trying those ideas out before they get too far up in the clouds. And the future plans for my output, Substack, will be continuing. Through October, I will take a bit of a break from writing new content to make room for free up a bit of space and energy for a new project, which I'll mention next. But I will be posting chunks of chapters from Taming the Apocalypse. So if you haven't had a chance to read that yet, if you jump on it before it goes behind the paywall in the first week that it's up, then you'll get a chance to have a look at that writing. So the podcast, I'm currently recording the second year of interviews, and reflecting the name change, I am widening the scope to include a few more people who are working on cultural experimentation. And again, I'll take a break from releasing episodes through October and restart in November to line up with the time that I started this project, this podcast, about a year ago. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's listened. It's been a huge effort to run this podcast solo. There's a lot of other much more professionally produced podcasts out there, which have a whole team of people doing the legwork. But I've enjoyed picking up all of the skills to do a decent job on my own and giving myself the freedom to take it in the direction that I feel it needs to go. And I have an amazing lineup of guests in the pipeline, which I am extremely excited to talk to and to share with you. So I really look forward to putting them out soon. So the final extra project that I'm leaning into is YouTube. So that's where the people are. The platform has its inconsistencies and complications, but that's where the people are. So if I want to get my ideas out to a wider audience through the Substack and the podcast, that's what I need to do. I need to figure out a way of putting something together that suits that particular audience and medium without losing too much of my soul. Let's put it that way. So in the YouTube, there'll be a greater emphasis on my planned group cultural experimentation projects. So one of those is to create a tool for the building out of the digital potato project that I did earlier in the year that was written up on the Substack. The ideal is to produce a web browser plugin that allows you to switch on and off to toggle images, sound, text, and color, and video. So you can basically change your internet experience to make it less viral and more nutritious by disabling those various ingredients. It's like going into the supermarket and refined sugar has been banned. Most of the junk food that's on the shelves would be borderline inedible, steering you towards the more nutritious decisions. The other thing I want to launch in the next year or so is a very ambitious project to create a new post-industrial writing technology that doesn't use paper. So yes, I'm excited to experiment with ways of using YouTube to make simple, interesting videos that don't take me days of editing to produce before they're ready to put out. So that's going to be a little bit of a trial and error process in the beginning, but I'm going to have fun with it. So we'll see where that goes. So now on to questions that were submitted by various followers of the blog and the podcast in my call to everyone to turn this into an Ask Me Anything episode to round off the first year. So first I have a question from Camriel. He says, "Hello Shane, thanks for putting out so much quality stuff. I'm a big fan and love your broad range of topics covered in talking and writing. You always speak about the importance of different people in all bioregions breeding their own low-input, high EROI crops. My question is, if you were to live in a temperate climate, which species show potential for doing breeding of these types of staple crops? Can be annual or perennial. Love to hear your thoughts, as I'd love to start breeding one." Okay, so there's general principles that you can follow to find crops that are likely to work for you, but if I just had to pick one, if it was me that was living in a colder climate and I was looking for something to really throw my effort into, it would be Typha. So these are the cattails that are often praised by foragers as one of the few carbohydrate sources in many temperate environments. Often it grows as a weed in disturbed environments, and it produces starch in rather remarkable quantities. There were some experiments by the US Army, I think, at the end of World War II, where they found that cattail wetlands produced like multiple times the carbohydrate output of maize crop on a similar area. But there are some problems, so how to harvest and extract that carbohydrate in an easy fashion, in a scalable fashion, isn't very well known. How to create and manage wetlands is a bit of a problem as well, though large swathes of the world used to be wetlands that were drained to make room for more wheat and maize. So yeah, there's potential of reversing that kind of process in the landscape. And also, Typha is very promiscuous. The species, as they're defined, have been genetically analyzed, and they regularly hybridize and create hybrid swarms. So yeah, that would be the one that I would recommend to looking into. And just in terms of practical breeding, at least it has separate pollen and female and male parts of the flowers, so controlled crossing shouldn't be too difficult. What else was there a problem with? With any perennial crop, managing clearing out the test plantings that you don't want anymore so that you can continue turning over generations. That's a little bit of a challenge with perennial crops. It's even more of a challenge with a wetland crop where removing every last little scrap of root that's hiding in the mud so that you can plant a new crop could be a little bit tricky. You probably would need to find a way of integrating pigs into the system because they're really good at digging through a marsh if you can drain it partially, and yeah, they'll dig out every last little bit of root and give you a nice clean starting place to grow your next generation of hybrids. So that's that answer. Okay, question from Taylor. How did you catch the crop breeding bug? So I think I've only talked about this indirectly before, but I started growing plants from a very young age, on top of being fascinated with any living thing I could get my hands on. But plants really spoke to me. I don't know why. I think I was really fascinated by their resilience and their adaptability, now that I think about it from day one. And that's probably what drew me into growing a lot of cacti and succulents. I really loved how they could get by with so little of something that every other plant seemed to need. And coincidentally, I took over my parents' flower gardens during a really severe drought where everyone else was struggling with water restrictions. And I basically just said, I'm going to let everything die and replace it with plants that can grow without supplementary irrigation. Because, I mean, we lived on a coast in a fairly warm climate. Even during a drought, there was quite a lot of rain compared to, true deserts. So there was no reason why things shouldn't have been able to grow without irrigation. So that kind of got me started on this idea of zero input agriculture. And then later in life, when I became aware of the structural risks that civilization was facing, I wanted to learn how to grow my own food. It kind of seemed like a natural step to do next. And little by little, finding ways of reducing inputs became an ever-growing obsession. And that necessarily led into crop breeding, particularly for my part of the world where we don't really have many crops that have pre-industrial tastes in terms of inputs and management. Somewhere along the way too, I started growing cacti and succulents again on my farm before I really moved up here full time and had a chance to really start doing crop breeding. And I started back again collecting succulents, just growing a very narrow range of species. But each of those species, I collected a large amount of genetic diversity, started doing hand pollination and selecting out superior forms. And I was getting amazing results, but I was also spending all this time in this poky little greenhouse with plants that would never have a chance in the world of growing in the ground here. And meanwhile, I was neglecting, my vast sprawling farm. So I sold them all off, and my greenhouse is still kind of empty. I need to get back in there and start using it for growing bunya seedlings and those kind of things. Okay, Philan, what's the worst symptom you've had from trying a new plant? Ooh, I should have thought a bit more about this one. Oh, no, I do remember one here. It's not one that I was breeding. I became friends with a local exotic fruit tree nursery woman. And one day she gave me a really big bag of yellow mangosteens, I think a Garcinia fruit. And she warned me to only eat like a couple of them at a time or they give me the runs. And I ate like 2 or 3, waited 6 hours maybe, and nothing happened. So I'm like, oh, I'm sure she was exaggerating. So I'm born in the year of the snake, and I tend to have a habit of unhinging my jaw and eating huge amounts of an ingredient all in one go. And yes, it turns out she wasn't lying. So yeah, that was a rather spectacular result from eating too much. And apart from that, I have a real sensitivity to oxalate in vegetables, and a few of the plants that I've grown are relatively high in oxalate, and I regularly go through cycles of tasting a little bit of them again, building up because I don't seem to be having any problems, and then hitting a wall where I suddenly end up with oxalate overload and I just have to swear off them for a while. So I don't know, maybe I need a microbial transplant to break down the oxalate a bit better. I'll have to find a volunteer. And also from Thilan, which animal breeding project do you want to happen the most? And I know I bang on and on about my elephant domestication project, so I should probably find something different here. If I could wave a magic wand for an animal breeding project, I really think there's huge potential for iguanas as the easiest thing to do in the short term would be a meat animal. Once you have that achieved, maybe you could breed them for a secondary product so you don't have to eat the whole animal. But yeah, iguanas are starting to be farmed in South and Central America because they've been eaten there for a long time. They are arboreal, they're herbivorous, they're just wonderful animals to work with. And yeah, I think combining tree fodder crops with iguanas could be an amazing domesticated system for the tropics and the subtropics in the future. And there's even a possibility of trying to blend in the saltwater tolerance from the Galapagos iguanas. So you could maybe incorporate them with mangrove kind of culture as their feedstock. So yeah, smoke on that. Okay, Schmendrick asks... Oh, here we go. They've turned my question back on me. If I could wave a magic wand and create any crop, what would it be? Let me think. I mean, I talk a lot about food crops and staple crops, so let's maybe shake this up. I think there's a huge opportunity for breeding medicinal plants. And let me think. I mean, we already kind of have effective pain relief through opium poppies, and they've been bred for thousands of years to be better at that function. And that's been like accelerated in recent generations for pharmaceutical use. But I think probably potent systemic herbal antimicrobial chemicals are probably the biggest missing piece. And I would love for like a microbial ferment to produce antibiotics. That seems like one of the easiest approaches. But if you're in a society that can't reliably handle fermentation, growing a plant is a lot easier. So yeah, my intuition is garlic vine. What's the name of it? I've forgotten the Latin name. Anyway, it's in the Bignoniaceae in the Jacaranda family. Nothing like true garlic, but it contains the same suite of active antimicrobial compounds. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you could do some selective breeding to make it a better source for herbal medicine. Though, I mean, it's already pretty good. It's used for that purpose in South America, where it grows natively, and I'm hoping to incorporate it into my home use in the future, because I regularly use garlic, but it doesn't grow here. So yeah, hopefully that it is a new enough answer. Okay, also from Schwendrick, what do you think are the most valuable uses of the remaining fossil fuel energy on the planet? Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I'm at the risk of repeating myself. In science fiction, we dream about like teleportation technology. We pretty much already have it in the form of the postal system. And for vanishingly small amounts of energy, you can send biological material all over the planet, provided, don't have biosecurity quarantine kind of barriers in your way. But the actual practical side of it is, at this point, like trivially simple. And yeah, if you go back in history, that wasn't the case. In the future, that probably won't be the case either. There's parts of the world that I'm very interested in that are getting difficult to access through the postal system. South Africa comes to mind, and there's other parts of Africa that are difficult to post a letter to, that we can't take that for granted anymore. So yeah, in the small amounts, I guess that. There's also a lot of relatively simple biotechnology processes that in practice rely today on disposable plastics for like holding the specimens and moving them around, like Eppendorf tubes and pipette tips and plastic petri dishes. And I mean, that was all done with glass in the past, but it was way more expensive and impractical. So doing home biotechnology, simple things like agrobacterial transformation, or even there is someone out there who bought like their own gold particle gene gun to do that kind of transformation at home in plant tissue culture. So yeah, there's all those kind of things that we can do a lot more easily today because we have plastic around. And I think I would say it's a consequential use of fossil fuels today that you might want to think about getting involved in. Oh, and final question from Schmendrick. If you could restart on your farm, knowing what you now know, how would you design things differently? Oh, so one of my most ambitious projects is the Bunya Diversity and Hybridization Project. And I was lucky to have a good year to go out and pick a whole lot of cones from all over the countryside to start that propagation with really diverse material. But the bulk of the pastures that had just had the cows removed off them were still thick pasture grasses, which were very difficult to get those trees established in. And looking at the amount of trees that I have growing from that era, even though I put tree guards around them and did all of this fiddling, the success rate was pretty damn low. So I could have, if I'd been wiser, I would have redirected that energy into planting support trees first and being prepared to wait a few years. And I'm kind of playing catch up. I'm waiting for the next big masting year with the local bunya population, so I can basically repeat all of that work over again. But this time, I'm hoping to be coordinated with the community, so every damn seed gets sowed. I have way more than I can handle. Like one cone goes a long way, and I want to be able to share that with the wider community. So hopefully it won't be all a total loss. And yeah, I'm just creeping up to 50, so there's a good chance I'll make it to 70 and get at least that one generation done, even if I start now. So yeah, hopefully not a total loss. And the trees that are in are beneficial in kind of getting that whole process started. It was a learning process. But yeah, now that I have canopy that needs managing, establishing those more particular trees like bunya seedlings underneath a mature canopy is way easier to do. So yeah, that's one thing. I wouldn't have planted tree mugwort all through my orchard, which has become a bit of a nightmare. What else? Oh, and my first ice cream bean alley, I would have put a bit higher up in the landscape where it doesn't get flooded. But I don't know. I'd only been through one flood at that stage, so I hadn't really gotten a sense for how the floods behave in the landscape. And I think that space is still going to end up, the flood-prone ice cream bean alley will still end up proving to be very useful in the long run. So it's not exactly a regret. And what else? Oh, I think I probably would have gotten rid of the cows sooner and started that support tree revegetation process, because you make so little money for all of the bother with cows that, yeah, it was kind of nice as a novelty because I'd never raised cattle before, but yeah, and it probably would have made transitioning to goats when I moved up full-time easier. So yeah, they're my main things. Oh, and before the quarantine laws became more restrictive, I probably would have imported more things, but realistically, if you're not in a position to grow them and use them while they're still fresh and viable, just putting them in storage in the fridge often doesn't pay out. They often get damaged by or stressed by that transportation process and benefit from being sowed immediately to make use of any viability that's still present. Okay, next, questions from Old Forest Thing. We often hear about what a post-industrial world could look like, but what do you think the journey there looks like? What's in between here and the post-industrial age? This is a really fascinating question, and I haven't seen many people attempt to delve into it. It's, you know, they say like making predictions is dangerous, especially about the future, and the closer to the immediate future you predict, the more dangerous it is, because the more quickly you're going to be proven incorrect. Even though in principle it should be easier to predict the short term, because like you're only making shorter predictions. Well, rather than making concrete predictions, I will talk about aspects of this process which I'm going to be fascinated to explore in the future, maybe through nonfiction, maybe through fiction. I don't know, I'm a little bit burnt out over writing fiction. Nonfiction's way higher return on investment. But yeah, so the degradation and eventual loss of the internet, I think, is going to be a major cultural landmark. And I think people already feel in their bones that the internet is degrading. Like peak internet was probably in the 2010s, and the utility and the accessibility of the internet is likely to steadily decline in the future, and at some point it's going to become unaffordable to some people in the world. I mean, it kind of already is, but people who previously had come to rely on it, bit by bit going to find that tool falls out of their grasp. So that's probably the thing I think is the most interesting. And yeah, I generally think that the techno-authoritarianism is going to be the winning strategy in the next couple of decades. So prepare accordingly, knowing that it probably is itself unsustainable might be the most useful mindset to help people get through that phase in history, you know, without throwing themselves against the gears of the machine, given it's going to grind to a halt eventually anyway. Okay, so next question is, if you were to design a physical community somewhere, maybe along the lines of your take on an eco-village for the purpose of adaptive breeding, what would that look like? Oh, this is an interesting question. From my reading, I think monasteries are probably the best blueprint for this kind of institution. It's kind of tried and true, and the people who tend to be interested in this hobby, let's call it, or vocation, I think are already pretty close to the mindset, on average, typically, of monks. Probably the biggest challenge is creating and equilibrating modern people into a culture which is kind of totalitarian in a miniature scale. That the abbot that runs a monastery is basically responsible for dictating everybody's activity at pretty much every waking moment and sleeping moment. Like, everything is regulated. And I think that could be doable. I think responsible use of technology, AI, could dramatically enhance that process, as long as you keep in mind that you may not have that tool forever. And yeah, it would basically just be an economy of scale. Like, so much of the cost of living today is driven by this very solitary fight that you have to wage against the economy to sustain yourself. And maybe, if you're lucky, you can like cobble together a couple of people to have buy one washing machine between you. Yeah, maybe share house living is starting to prepare some people for monastic living. But yeah, I think that could appeal to people, to have relative security in terms of finance and accommodation, and not having to worry about what's for dinner all on your own every single night, and to have a whole bunch of time freed up to devote to crop breeding or adaptive breeding of whatever people decide is the priority. So yeah, I think that has legs, and it's another thing that I would like to explore in more detail in the future. So watch this space. Next question from Old Forest Thing. What do you think are important steps for young people to take now in order to help secure the future for future generations? And they say ecologically, food system wise, socially, whatever you think is most appropriate. Well, probably one of the biggest priorities is getting the legacy crop diversity out of gene banks and into people's hands and cultures. So I think that's probably the biggest risk, that something like the GRIN database in the US gets defunded, or the whole economy goes down. There's a really amazing story I've got to look into the history of a seed bank in Russia during the World Wars. I think it was the World Wars, when Stalingrad was being sieged and everyone was starving. And yeah, these people guarding this institution basically protected the seed stocks with their lives, because they knew if people just broke in and ate them, then that would massively cripple the recovery on the far side of the war. So yeah, we're kind of doing a low stress version of that at the moment, with these apparently stable institutions that are running on a shoestring budget, like GRIN, sitting on thousands of years worth of crop genetics, which doesn't really exist anywhere else in an easily accessible form. And all you have to do is write an email or a letter and let them know what you're doing and convince them that you're serious, and you can get that material for free. So, and that opportunity may not be around in another 10 years' time if things deteriorate a bit quicker than I would like. So that's one thing. Socially, I think if you're trapped in a city and you can't do much in the way of growing and farming, don't despair. You've got an opportunity to do cultural experiments. And I think we need to find new models of collective living, and to see it as an opportunity to not just go back to multi-generational households, like a medieval kind of style of living, or clans, or just waiting until things get so bad that we let corporations or governments dictate our lives for us. So Yeah. But my advice would be, rather than trying to get everything right and build a permanent shared living arrangement, intentional community all in one go, is to do it in little short bursts of time focused on particular aspects of how people interact with each other. So yeah, well, I mean, even a share house has a limited time on the lease. Or you could have a weekend or a week retreat where people go to one place to do something together, and I think it gives you the ability to do wilder experiments, knowing that there is an end, just a few days away, and the point of it isn't necessarily to make things succeed on the first try. The point on it is to stress test the model and find out what aspects of it don't work particularly well. It's a little bit like doing a crop variety trial. Like, you actually want most of the things that you put in the ground to not work, because that gives you valuable information, and eventually it points you towards the things that do work. So yeah, that's my take on that. Final question from Old Forest Thing. What is your stance on invasive species in general, and what contexts are right for breeding versus control? Ooh, this is an interesting one. So the first point I always make is that invasive species control infrastructure is extremely unsustainable, and it's very likely that, with a few notable exceptions, that all of those efforts to push back the invasive species and create little artificial islands of restored, in inverted commas, ecosystems will all just be reversed the second that pressure of machines and herbicide and all those kind of things is reversed. With the exception of biological control, which I think does have its place in taking species that are in the upswing of their kind of local adaptation, where they can cause enormous headaches for well, let's say people, and wildlife to varying degrees as well. So yeah, speeding up that process of re-equilibration through biological control, I think, is the way to go, and it generally is done well in the modern world. In terms of breeding, I definitely think when you see a particular species growing out of control like that, it's a real hint of an opportunity to balance that vigor with higher utility by taking that invasive genetics and mixing it with something that has less invasive and higher productive potential. And yeah, I think there's many different ways you can do that. I mean, one possibility is just grafting on the roots of the invasive species with more desirable varieties, if you want to get cut to production in a hurry. But yeah, otherwise hybridization and then selecting for plants that aren't don't have the worst traits of the most invasive strain that's getting all of the bad press. And I mean, apart from that, there's more simple, indirect ways of using invasives, often by coupling them with livestock. And seeing people using goats to great effect. I mean, goats used to outnumber cattle by 5-1 in the pre-industrial world, but cattle are much easier to manage industrially. So that's why we've forced all of our landscape for cattle to turn into grasslands, when often it would rather be thickets and forests and shrublands. So yeah, it's good to see that kind of thing happening, and it turns what is a problem for one particular kind of agriculture into a resource for a slightly different kind of agriculture. Okay, next questions are from Michael Longfield. How would you go about creating a plant by animal hybrid, and is it theoretically possible? Okay, that's a really cool question. So whenever you see a science fiction idea like this, all you have to do is spend a bit of time digging around nature, and you realize that it kind of has already been done. Usually if something is possible, it's probably already been done. And there are a range of different animals which incorporate photosynthetic elements into their tissues to varying degrees. The one that takes us further would be the sea hares. So they eat seaweeds. They break down the cells of those seaweeds and liberate the chloroplasts. And rather than digesting the chloroplasts, they absorb them into their own tissues and concentrate them in special organs in their skin. And these little sea slugs have such a low basal metabolic rate, and they live in places that have really clear water with lots of light. I think they supply a decent chunk of their energy needs through these stolen stolen chloroplasts. Unfortunately, they lack the machinery to induce those chloroplasts to undergo division. So they're constantly having to replace them by eating a little bit more seaweed. But it gives you an idea about what's possible. For a high energy use animal like a human being, I think I've seen calculations that if you put chloroplasts all throughout our skin and they're operating at maximum efficiency and we sat in the sun all day long, we could produce a few % of our energy needs. So not that useful for our current kind of way that we set up. But who knows? I mean, maybe humans could evolve into something that had much, much lower energy needs. Maybe we just keep our thumb so we can scroll on our phones and point our eyeballs in roughly the right direction. And you get other animals like giant clams and corals, which function more like plants because they have a symbiotic brown algae that is lodged in their tissues that supplies a decent amount of their energy. So yeah, it is not just theoretically possible, but practically possible, but it comes with some limitations and caveats. And yeah, an animal like that sea hare, I think people are researching to see if they can add the genes to the sea hare's genome to allow it to actually sustain its own chloroplast population. And there's general questions about the induced evolution of new symbiotic organelles in various tissues. And again, if you look at nature, protists do this all the time. I think a nitrogen-fixing bacteria that's symbiotic and turning into an organelle in a protist was discovered quite recently. So yeah, the boundaries between the various kingdoms in life are not as rock solid. There's a few little holes that can be poked in the walls there. Okay, so next question from Michael. What are your thoughts on the origin of life and abiogenesis? So it's such a fascinating question, and the data is so scanty, but the more I read about it, the more I think that the conversion from simple chemicals like a Miller-Urey experiment on Earth to produce the first functional protocells, it doesn't quite stack up. I think the timelines and the scale of the planet and the likely conditions, there's definitely strong evidence that common molecules critical for biology form very readily under a set of different conditions. And those conditions aren't just common on Earth, they're common throughout the entire galaxy, and there's great clumps and clouds of RNA and amino acids and all sorts of things out there in space. So the chances that Earth, this little tiny speck of those compounds, was the place where the critical steps happened, doesn't quite make sense. So that raises the question, well, it means that we're probably, life on Earth is probably descended from some kind of panspermia. Exactly what the nature of that is, we don't really know. But there is pretty good evidence that even Earth-derived microbes are surprisingly resilient in space. Like the surface of the International Space Station has been swabbed, and there's all sorts of like fungi growing on the outside of it, which nobody expected. Not particularly quickly, and not everything, but there's definitely something out there. So yeah, I think the prospects for panspermia are looking very good. I've seen a really, really interesting calculation, an information theory, kind of complexity theory calculation, that says if you look at the information content of genomes of organisms and you project that backwards through time to where it crosses the zero x-axis to where it started, it roughly lines up with the current understanding for the age of the universe. So I've seen a really good, a really intriguing model that there was a Goldilocks era in the evolution of the universe. So the universe is argued to have started out in a denser, hotter state and have gradually kind of expanded and cooled and condensed down into the scattering of stars and galaxies that we see today and other minor clumpy objects in between. And the idea is that there was a period during that cooling process where the entire universe was compatible with the production and rearrangement of biologically relevant molecules. So yeah, rather than just one little tiny warm pool on Earth, the entire universe could have gone through a phase where it was compatible with life. And that, coupled with the ease of forming a whole range of cornerstone biological molecules, it wouldn't be that surprising if we do eventually get evidence of life from far, far, far away, like other galaxies even. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see that it's quite similar biochemically to life, with a few surprising variations, but I would expect it to be more similar than different if that model is true. Next question from Michael. If you wanted to create an entirely new life form from scratch, creating life from non-life, how would you go about doing it? And this is a really interesting question because even people who research this aren't quite sure where the critical boundary lies. So, like, you can take a living organism and you can kill it in various ways that mean that all of its biomolecules are still intact. They're all still in the right places. The only thing that seems to be lacking are the chemical gradients across membranes that drive the whole process. So yeah, once you lose those chemical gradients, it doesn't matter how much molecular machinery and complexity you have lined up. There's no force driving it. Maybe that's a good analogy for like our industrial civilization once the energy sources run out. So yeah, how would you go about doing it? You need to find a way of reinstating those gradients. And I mean, it's probably easiest to do with something like a bacterial cell if you can change the extracellular chemical environment so that you recreate a gradient. And I'm sure somebody has tried doing that, but I don't know. I haven't heard of it succeeding. But I mean, some people would probably argue that the bacteria aren't actually dead. They're just in such a low energy state that they're dormant. So yeah, the boundary's messy. And would I do it differently? Let me think. Oh, there's so many things you could tinker with, but you don't really know the full consequences until you do it, which is maybe all the more reason to try. Yeah, the people who are looking at expanding the genetic code and the number of amino acids, it's kind of interesting, but the current range of amino acids do pretty much everything that you could want them to do, and some of them only evolved relatively recently compared to the others. Like, there were refinements, like just adding a little variation on chemical properties that wasn't absolutely essential to begin in life, but was nice to kind of add as a bonus. So there's a lot of dependency in biology on cofactors. So like vitamins and metals that perform unusual biochemical functions. Some of those you might be able to build into amino acids rather than relying on a vitamin. But on the flip side, controlling and regulating the abundance of those cofactors, those vitamins and metals, is a really useful mechanism for regulating the activity of a whole bunch of enzymes. So I'm not sure you would actually be better off building that into the amino acids from the ground up. You'd have to find other channels for regulating activity. So yeah, maybe it's pretty close to the optimum already. And finally, what is the meaning of life? You know, got to throw that one in. This is a big question. Or maybe it's a really badly formed question. I've developed a rule of thumb that if philosophers are still debating a question after like 1,000 years, it's probably not worth wasting your time on. Yeah, meaning of life is kind of like one of the primary ones. I guess I would answer this in the idea that you can give your life meaning by exploring the range of biological possibilities. And you only have to look at the history of the evolution of life, even relatively recent evolution, to see how surprises can kind of pop up out of nowhere and the whole system can undergo phase changes, which you never could have predicted by just kind of looking at how things were going up to that point. It's like a phase change. Like if you gradually heat up a block of ice from like minus 20 degrees to minus 0.5 degrees Celsius, not much would change. Like some of the physical properties might be a little bit different, but it would still be ice. And then you just change it a little bit further. You warm it a little bit more, and it turns into this stuff water that you've never seen before that behaves in a completely different way. And yeah, that's a system as simple as, just water molecules at different temperatures. Biological systems are, I don't know how many orders of magnitude more complicated than that and more unpredictable. And probably the way that life has evolved up to this point, kind of being self-directed, has limited its capacity to explore in really odd directions. I think throwing humans into the mix with their capacity for imagination and intentionality means that we can potentially steer this little green spaceship that we're living upon in all sorts of directions that it's never considered doing before. And I find that really inspiring. Okay, we're getting to... Oh, we've got a few more here. Okay, from Professor Porcupine, another lovely past guest from the show. What do you think about a living seed bank, a network of seed savers preserving seed genetics in addition to a traditional long-term cold storage seed bank? I think it's the only thing that's going to be viable in the long run, because refrigeration has only been around for about 100 years, and it's only been cheap for about 50 of them. So, and there's a lot of parts of the world that they don't have a cold chain. Like if you want to send a vaccine to parts of Africa, you're going to have a really hard time doing it because it'll be in the back of a four-wheel drive for multiple days, traveling across the landscape trying to get to the people who you want to treat. So yeah, I think living seed banks are the only option. And yeah, particularly the part about it being distributed, I would love to see a culture of people who wander into your community with a wizard's robe lined with all of these fancy seeds that they've collected on their many varied wanderings, and that those people would be welcomed in pretty much any community, regardless of the current political climate, because they're seen as being outside of petty politics. Next question. What do you think about bending tree branches sideways to accumulate auxins and thus shift hormonal balance from fruit mode into fruit mode more quickly? Yes, I guess. I mean, with trees, it's always a trade-off. Like if I always think of dear Luther Burbank, who managed to breed chestnuts that start flowering. I think it was 6 months, less than 6 months from seed. Which, when you first read that in a book, you're like, that's amazing. Like it solved the problem. Like you can now grow tree crops and not have to wait around. The problem was, if you go back to these particular hyper-precocious chestnut seedlings, 5 years later, they're maybe like 2 feet tall, because they have put so much of their limited resources into producing like 1 seed or 3 seeds when they're only a few inches tall, that they never had a chance to like build their foundation. So those kind of manipulations of tree hormones, I think, are really interesting. I would follow up with Bactelium's suggestion that discovering ways of manipulating the masting cycle in tree crops, like I don't know, like exposing them to smoke chemicals or something, simple like that, inducing like a massive production of crops, so that you can skip production in years when the squirrels and the rats are building up too much. That would be even more powerful and even simpler, because you wouldn't have to go around like physically manipulating every single branch of every single tree. Question 3. How would you speed run plant breeding, both in annuals and woody perennials like fruit trees? So I know you're obsessed with this, and we've shared some really interesting papers. For annuals, I think this can work really, really well because you can, with the right manipulation of like photoperiod and temperature in pretty simple and pretty small setups, you can get some crops to produce, like I said before, a small amount of seeds. But for like a quinoa plant is a really good example of this. They can grow to like 10 centimeters tall, and each plant will still produce like 30, 50 seeds. And when they're really tiny like that, it's much easier to manipulate pollination, like do hand crosses, compared to like fully grown plants out in the field. So yeah, for the right kind of crops, you can generate really, really interesting properties really, really quickly. You do need to take those crops back out into the field on a regular basis to grow them to full size under the normal production conditions to check that you're not losing anything too vital. There could be a risk of really screwing up the plant microbiome doing that process if you're not careful, because growing under those artificial controlled conditions is a really good way of alienating microbes that like growing in real dirt. For perennials and fruit trees, I think it's a little bit more risky. Though if you're trying to induce a change in the plant that is really simple and easy to assess without having to grow a full tree to full maturity, then you're doing like a single gene horizontal gene transfer with a really obvious trait when the gene is incorporated and expressed. So yeah, in that case, speed breeding might be useful, but I don't know. I really don't know. I want to see someone try and do it though. I'm sure it's possible. But yeah, it's convincing them to go back to the long, slow life cycles with those advantages but challenges as well. I think that's where the challenge lies with the naturally slower growing species. Question 4. What are your thoughts about talking to plants? Can we ask cactus plants to be less thorny in the next generation? How does music affect plants? This is one of those really interesting fields that was super popular in academia, in like proper science in the 70s. I think there was a big boom in it. And then it kind of fell into a reputation trap of it being like somewhere where the crackpots go. It was around about the same time that general parapsychology fell into disrepute, despite there being like consistent observation of like odd things under pretty well controlled conditions. So personally, I feel a non-verbal connection with my plants. I think they're aware of what is going on a lot more than we realize. The specific example of asking cactus plants, Luther Burbank, I think, was more of a mystic than people realized, than he let on. And he grew probably millions of prickly pear seedlings looking for thornless plants. And maybe he got what he asked for. There were strains that were lacking the large spines that are produced, but he could never get one to stop producing the little microscopic glassy glockid hairs, which are probably the bigger challenge when you're handling prickly pear cacti. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. And, see, a lot of hallucinogenic cacti have been managed by humans to varying degrees, and they are often spineless, partly because they often come from, like peyote come from a really extremely arid habitat where there's not a lot of herbivores, and they're so packed with alkaloids, like bitter alkaloids, that not many things enjoy chewing on them very much. For more wet climate species like the Trichoceras, they tend to the more psychoactive ones of those tend to have fewer spines, and they have been grown by humans, I believe, for a very long period of time. So, yeah, whether it was due to the plants picking up on the humans' preferences, I don't know. Looking at Michael Levin's work about the developmental flexibility of morphology, even without changing the genome. And I mean, we see this in like grafted plants. There's often sports which develop, like different colored leaves or something, or flowers. Yeah, maybe it's just a sport. Maybe there's something more to it. I don't know. I think, and same with the music. I think it needs more sincere research in the future. It'd be interesting to see if it affects hybridization potential, because that's probably where the biggest leverage point is for changing plants. Okay, next question. Human manure. Can our gut bacteria communicate with soil life and tell the plants we grow which nutrients our bodies need most? Oh, now that's an interesting one. So, a lot of our digestion is driven by our microbial community, and our body does actively influence which microbes are favored through various mechanisms, like feeding special complex polysaccharides in our mucus to favor the growth of certain kinds. So I wouldn't put it past the realms of reason that if you had a, phosphorus deficient diet, that your body would be able to cultivate a microbiome which helped you break down and mobilize and absorb phosphorus more effectively. And then when that human manure ends up out in your fields, the same genetic information in those microbes could find its way into the soil bacteria that assists in the growth of the plants, because they would presumably be living through the same phosphorus deficiency. So that's a really interesting idea. I haven't heard that before. And I'm really glad you sent it to me. That's got me tickled. Next question. Artificial selection versus natural selection pressure. Are we as Homo sapiens not capable of doing natural selection? Or is it the intent that makes selection artificial? This is a really interesting question, because I think it exposes the artificiality of the concept of artificial selection, because non-human organisms have been shaping the evolution of other non-human organisms since the dawn of time. I mean, the relationship between specialist pollinating insects and particular flowers is a really great example of this, where both parties have changed each other. And who knows if there's intent involved in that? Like the degree of mimicry that some plants are capable of is quite eerie, and I'm not sure if it's easy to explain it just through random variation and selection. It's something that could be potentially empirically tested and proven or disproven. So I think it counts as a admittedly far out scientific hypothesis that is worthy of consideration. What is different about human intention? Arguably, our ability to imagine into the future, which we presumably developed through the manufacture of complex tools, where you have to plan multiple steps ahead and kind of visualize inside the rock that you're chipping into pieces. So yeah, I think that is a transferable skill when you are applying selection pressure to another organism, or even to humans themselves. How capable we are of doing that, I don't know. I don't think we've been long enough at it to really know how good we are, or how good we could be at it in the future. Let me read this next question. Oh, I see. So he's referring to us unintentionally selecting a huge range of organisms as well, such as mosquitoes that like living in human-made bodies of water, or all of the weeds that have come along for the ride with agriculture. And I'm really fascinated with the idea that agriculture for the first few thousand years was a lot easier, because the weeds hadn't gotten around to evolving how to infiltrate our cultivated fields and get around all of our mechanisms for getting rid of them. So I mean, it's partly a matter of scale. Like the example with selecting weeds accidentally, there is so much the scope with which weeds are put through that selection pressure, like the number of plants and the pressure and the consistency of that pressure is so much more than we can apply with like deliberately doing a hand cross and a grow out of the hybrid generation, looking for varieties. So yeah, I think you're onto something there, that our logistical capacity for doing deliberate, conscious, selective breeding is probably smaller than our potential for doing it accidentally. And it makes you think there might be ways doing of joining those two dynamics together somehow, so that we can, yeah, I don't know. And I mean, in modern times, the separation of production and breeding in crops is a huge problem as well, because it shrinks the amount of resources and scope that's applied to crop breeding. It's a more intense selection process, and maybe it generates more extreme results faster, but then all of the unintended consequences of cobbling together a superficial solution kind of come back to bite you when you scale things up. So yeah. Okay, next question. Is discipline a self-imposed selection pressure or a resistance to selection pressure? How do you recommend bending the path of least resistance in your favor? Yeah, this is an interesting question about the psychology of actually pulling off crop breeding, because it's not the most natural of human activities. Like, and you definitely see people with unusual temperaments tend to get into it. They tend to be in like the top 1% in terms of patience, because the process takes multiple years and the results aren't guaranteed. In fact, even if you succeed eventually, there's lots of failure that's guaranteed along the way. So you need to have, again, top 1% immunity to, psychological negative reactions to when things don't work. And yeah, that temperament broadly overlaps with good experimental scientists, though. Anyway, related tangent, the structure of academia tends to discourage people with those skills, those temperaments, from ending up in research laboratories, which is another factor, I think, which is wasting the potential of the research institutions that we have today. Anyway, but yeah, this idea of discipline, it's not the kind of thing that you can force yourself through, because it's such a marathon. Yeah, a marathon's a good analogy, because yeah, if you sprint, then your legs are just going to seize up and fail before you even get like 10% of the way that you want to go. So, yeah, you need to have that obsessiveness, but if it's not linked to patience and gentleness and kind of that wu wei, like going with the flow as various successes and failures and challenges roll over you, then yeah, but yeah, how to help people who might be in the top 10% of those traits, or maybe they're really strong in like some of them, but they're lacking in others. How to help more people who are like almost naturally talented for doing crop breeding to like join the fun. That's a really interesting problem, and you've got me thinking that you've crystallized for me that it's one that I think has to become integrated into mentorship and building a sustainable culture around post-industrial biotechnology. So yeah, I don't know if I actually answered that one, but I at least acknowledge that it's a very important question. Next question. Do you see potential for one world government forming anytime soon? And what do you think it will look like? I think for all intents and purposes, we already have one. I mean, the British Empire was pretty damn close. I mean, it was kind of functionally a one world government. And it didn't exactly just go away. It kind of moved its center of mass to America after pretty much before the World Wars. It was already starting to, and definitely when Britain got smashed, the centre just moved. And this, I realized the other day, this is really similar to what happened with Rome, that the functional centre of Rome moved from the Roman Empire moved from Rome itself to Constantinople. What was it called? Istanbul. When the empire got too big for the remaining resources to manage, and it split in two. And yeah, the western half fell apart pretty quickly, but the eastern half kept going for another 1,000 years. So I think there's a real echo there with what happened with the open oceanic maritime shipping trade, capitalist corporate scientific economic system. So yeah, I think more or less since like the late 1800s, we've had a one world government, but varying degrees of local faces of that government have been put into place. And the Romans did this kind of thing too. I mean, the Mongols did it as well. They like rolled into a place. If the people were wise enough to realize they didn't have the defenses to hold them off, and they surrendered, usually the Mongols left those people in place and just said, pay us a huge amount of taxes and we won't come and like cut your throats. The Romans did something pretty much similar. Probably extracted a few more slaves along the way. But so yeah, that's what I think it'll look like. I think it will become more obvious that we are living under that kind of system as time goes on. The internet is amazing and powerful, but it's, we all have pretty much been told that it's this massive surveillance and control mechanism that hasn't been consistently activated to its full power, but is in place. And we're all pretty much completely dependent upon it for day-to-day survival. So yeah, I think it's just going to, as that system becomes more desperate to maintain control, it's likely to become less delicate in the way that it exercises that control. So yeah, that's the kind of techno-authoritarianism future that I think is something ahead, but probably not going to be permanent. Do you believe in God or do you know God? Oh, that's an interesting question. I grew up in a very non-religious household. In my parents' generation, I think they were the last generation of young people to regularly go to church when they were growing up, but not really believe it. So it was very easy for them to stop going when they had their own children, and they didn't feel particularly compelled to make us go. I got to go to like religious education on afternoon in primary school, and I jumped between all of the different denominations just out of curiosity. I went through a phase of actually going to our local church, and it was shocking, like even back in the 80s, that it was pretty much all people in their like advanced old age, and it was pretty obvious that it was dying out at that point. And in terms of personal experiences, I've had a lot of inexplicable experiences in my life, but none that can be readily mapped onto any religion that I've ever seen described, which I think maybe points to the revival of something like a religion in the future. Maybe some of my thinking will end up bundled into that, and for the benefit of the people involved. But yeah, believe. I think it's pretty easy to argue, even with all of our scientific advancements, that there are things beyond measurement, and that there are coincidences that are difficult and possibly impossible to describe using a materialist reductionist mindset. So yeah, I guess that makes me agnostic, that I acknowledge what I don't know, and something like God might be part of that structure that's off the edge of the map. Okay, I've got a few more questions from somebody whose name I didn't record. I'm so sorry. Hopefully you recognize these, and thank you. Is there a back to the land movement forming again, like how it did in the 60s and 70s? What are people going to do? Oh, sorry, that's a different question. Is there a back to the land movement? I think there is. It's it's tricky because digital culture today is so fragmented and diverse. Compared to like back in the 60s and 70s, it was off the back of a relatively small number of pre-existing books or books that jumped on the bandwagon, and limited channels for people to communicate and find each other and be inspired by different ideas. So if there is a back to the land movement today, it's so fragmented that I don't think we can call it a movement in the same way that previous cycles have tried to do it. And I think this is really good. It's like a crop variety trial where we're planting, all of these different combinations of ideas, some of them pretty wild, and just seeing what works. And you see a lot of people tapping into social media to kind of share what they're doing. I'm always very grateful when people are honest about what's not working so that people can maybe learn from their example. And even when it frequently all falls apart and they give it up and they move back to the city and just, swear off their fantasy of like skipping around with baby goats all day long and being cottagecore and picking flowers in a bonnet. So yeah, it is happening. I think the centralizing economic pressures are still, or cultural pressures are still extreme, and we're still seeing a lot of shift of rural to urban populations, mostly in the developing world. And yeah, the people, in terms of bulk numbers, the people escaping the cities and suburbia, I think are still fairly small, but the way the economy is going, the incentives to get out of the cities will increase, but it will still, I think, be a minority of people who make the reverse trip and do it successfully in a sustainable long-term way. It's a big challenge. I mean, I'm trying to do this, and I think I've only achieved a few modest but meaningful steps along the way of where I originally wanted to go. So yeah, I'm not surprised that a lot of people try to do it the recommended way and realize that it doesn't work, at least for them, in their particular situation. What are people going to do when AI takes their jobs? Or is AI a huge bubble that will fail to do this effectively? My current outlook on this is both. I think that AI is going to take people's jobs because it is a huge bubble that will crash the stock market and the economy and all of the unsustainable things that we've been doing for the last few decades to keep the ball rolling along. So yeah, AI won't take jobs because it works. It will take jobs because it fails, and it'll tear down a lot of current economic activity in the process. And it's funny, now that I think about it, that could actually be a good thing, because people need a story. They need a scapegoat to explain why things have happened. And I mean, look back at history. One story that can capture people's imagination is that, this particular small group of people is responsible for everything that's gone wrong. And the obvious reaction is to expend all of that built up kind of energy and resentment and confusion by attacking that minor group, whether they were actually behind it or not. In this round, that could be the elites, but it could be AI. We could just find that we hate AI because it destroyed the economy and we got so silly about it. And ironically, even if parts of it start working, maybe there'll be a kind of Butlerian jihad and the broad population will just categorically reject it, even if it costs them a little bit more money of like whatever pennies they've got left to rub together. Maybe something like that will happen around AI. Yeah, that's my take on that. I don't think I have anything more to say. What do I think about permaculture? Do you practice it or incorporate aspects? Okay, so one of permaculture's really core principles is the productivity of edges. like between the forest and the grassland, you get this really interesting transitional zone where all sorts of interesting things happen that aren't possible in either like uniform ecosystem. And I apply that to myself with respect to permaculture. So I am living on the abundant edge of permaculture with the way I do everything here. So I love permaculture. I'm extremely grateful that it existed. It served a really critical role when it appeared in the 70s, and it managed to get a whole bunch of things right and propagate itself and evolve through the 80s and the 90s and the noughts. And I think there's a huge amount of lessons that can be learned from that. There's also a whole bunch of things that it intended to achieve when it set out that kind of got put in the too hard basket, and energy was kind of put on other things, particularly adapting for vegetables in small spaces. Like everything became zone 0 and zone 1. And that was just adapting to like the physical realities that most people doing permaculture were doing it in the suburbs or in even smaller spaces. So yeah, I don't fundamentally criticize the movement for having to shift in that direction. So yeah, but do I think what I do is permaculture? I guess. Yes and no. Yeah, I think permaculture has become such a broad umbrella that you can't really define the edges anymore. And I think that's for its benefit as well. It's another thing that you could learn from that very successful movement if you're trying to create something comparable for the next phase of change. What is your stance on right to repair? Should we have a right to repair things we own, or should manufacturers call it hacking and a violation of their intellectual property? Let me think. I take a kind of realpolitik approach to this. As the tools that we use become more and more complex, I think these kind of issues of rent-seeking control of that technology just become more and more intensive. I should probably write a piece about this one day, but the basic idea that this principle goes all the way back to the Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age population boom happened because farmers got superior tools for doing crop production. So, they could do X acres of barley with a bone hoe. When they got a bronze hoe, maybe they could do 50% more or twice as much. I'm just making up numbers. Which was wonderful until the source of, well, for one thing, it was wonderful until the source of bronze was no longer available, and then, disaster and population crashed because people couldn't farm as efficiently anymore. But in the short term, even when the system was working, it made those farmers beholden to whoever was in control of the bronze supply. So it catalyzed the centralization of states, the extraction of rents, and the farmers who did decide to do whatever their local warlord or king who was in control of the metal supply demanded, basically reproduced and overran the farmers who decided they wanted to just grow less and use the simpler tools that they could create themselves. So it's exactly the same dynamic that happened when large horse-drawn automated scything machines for harvesting grain came along and displaced all of the peasants who used to do that kind of critical job by hand, or when bigger mechanically powered tractors replaced the horse-drawn implements. That dynamic goes all the way back to the start of technology, and you could probably find aspects of it in trading networks of critical goods among Homo sapien forager tribes. Like obsidian was a really valuable material, but it only came from certain territories. So I'm sure the people who were sitting on top of the obsidian pile leveraged that when they were negotiating with their neighbors. Question. Will we own nothing and still be happy? I am constantly impressed by the capacity for the human mind to be reshaped. And we have the most powerful tools, the most pervasive tools in the form of the internet for doing that right now. And we've seen a few interesting examples of how that can happen in recent history. So, I mean, if happiness is subjective and people can be happy with much less material consumption, maybe this model will actually work, at least for a time. Or I shouldn't say work, I should say it might be superior to the alternative of everything just like disintegrating, 30 years in advance of when it really had to. So yeah, I'm kind of, again, playing realpolitik with this dynamic, and I don't necessarily hate the idea of a phase of techno-authoritarianism. I think it might be useful for buying the next generation time to lay the foundation for what has to come after techno-authoritarianism. So yeah, basically silver lining, gift horse in a mouth, looking in the mouth kind of dynamic, that might be the most productive way of looking at it. Provided our evil internet manipulating overlords aren't too insane. And ironically, like the more difficult we make their lives, maybe the more likely they are to go insane and get really nasty. So there's a balance of power kind of negotiation thing that happens between the peasants and the elites. And stable equilibria in those dynamics can be a useful opportunity, provided that you keep in mind that stability doesn't last forever. Okay, next question. Is self-defense a universal human right? What about access to clean water, air, and food? Okay, it's in two parts. Self-defense... Human rights are... Who did I see talking about this? Marina Karlova is I think her name. She's an Eastern European... I guess you'd call her a philosopher. She's kind of like an anti-therapy culture crusader who's doing some interesting stuff. I linked to her on a long forum Substack post a while ago just to let people know about her. And yeah, she pointed out that this idea of human rights is... It's built on a unexamined foundation where people are so disempowered that they have to be granted those rights. They have to be told they have permission to do something. And again, realpolitik. If you have the power to do something, if you have the ability to do something, you don't really need permission. So the cultural framework of human rights is really just a shared agreement that people have broad permission to act in particular ways without running the risk of blowback. So in that narrower sense of what a human right is, self-defense can be a useful human right to have in your society. Though it depends on the dynamics of the tools that are being used for the self-defense. And like this is where you get into the whole boring gun debate that, the US goes on and on about, because what a gun is a moving target. This reminds me of a short story which I may or may not get around to writing one day, which I think would go under the title of something like The Impossible City. So the idea is a world where something like a nuclear bomb, like a uranium-based atomic bomb, is so simple to make that like any peasant farmer, like anybody anywhere with like the most basic access to resources can put one of these together, strap it to their back, and level an entire city. And it got me wondering about what would the dynamics of this society be if it was like strategically impossible to put thousands of people all on top of each other in one place. Like cities have formed organically all over the world for like really obvious biophysical reasons. But if you add this extra ingredient into the mix and it's too dangerous to put all of those people in one place because they could just... You only need one person to be disgruntled enough with the state of affairs to like wipe out everyone else's economies of scale living together in a city. how would society adapt? What other course would the flow of energy and resources take? I think that's a really interesting thought experiment, which I haven't taken through to its conclusion yet. But yeah, self-defense is a universal human right. I'll have to talk about that more in the future. You got me thinking about that. I think it can tie into biotechnology and culture in interesting ways to decentralize the use of force, so it can't be monopolized through high technology. Anyway, that's an interesting post I will do one day in the future. What about access to clean water, air, and food? This is an interesting one because, like, human evolution has been dramatically shaped by our access to dirty air. Very, very early on, when we started cooking our food, we got exposed to carcinogens in the smoke. Like, we were like leaning over like smoky campfires, and as a result, we have developed a suite of detoxification mechanisms in our livers that make us much less susceptible to that poisoning. Similar thing happened with access to clean water. So high density lowland agricultural societies, you've got so many people packed in that all of the groundwater, all the surface water, got contaminated by human waste. And as a result, agricultural humans have developed all of these mechanisms for being more resistant to like diarrhea, waterborne diseases. And that's a bit of a superpower. And then on top of that, you have all of the technological mechanisms like drinking tea because you have to boil the water. And same with clean food. Like a hunter-gatherer diet is arguably a lot healthier and diverse and better balanced than an agricultural diet. So you could argue that the more recently evolved diets are dirtier by that criteria, going all the way back to the start of agriculture. But we have learnt to adapt to it. So, I mean, up to a point, humans are adaptable after a period of stress and suffering to like figure out how to get past those barriers. So, yeah, I don't know. I think we have a right to access to our own pollution because we have a responsibility to either stop polluting or learn to live with it. So yeah, that's a kind of different take on that. Is the internet a blessing or a curse? Are we better with it or without it? Blessing and a curse in both states. So yeah, the internet is, on the surface, a cultural technology that allows us to consume whatever information that we want, but in practice, it is the most centralizing influence on human culture in all of history. Like, there's billions of people who can see the same messages, and it's still basically owned by authorities who have the ability to coordinate, let's say, propaganda, in the broader sense, messaging on the scale of the entire planet. That's never really been possible before. So the responsibility lies both with those elites, what they do with that power of messaging. They could use it to, the benefit of everyone, kumbaya, or they could fumble it and cause enormous synchronized harm to the entire human race. For the individuals, the same kind of bargain applies. You can use it to just open your eyeballs in an indiscriminate fashion and absorb an even higher rate of advertising and manipulation than has ever happened before, or you can put in the extra attention and use it to serve your own needs, and making that extra effort to seek out the things that are actually beneficial to you. And yeah, I think it's like any technology. It's like fire. It can destroy things or it can transform them. It's up to us to use the internet to its maximum potential while we still have it. And yeah, I'm old enough to remember how difficult a lot of things were before the internet came along. So I'm determined to use it as much as I can while it lasts. Next question. Oh, what are your thoughts on using a grapevine or other xylem-based plant filter to filter dirty water and make it safe to drink again? I love this. I love this, and I can recall now seeing there's some like tropical vines that carry enough water that you can cut them and then like fill a cup. But yeah, I think that's a really beautiful idea. Um, and I mean, it's a pretty the effectiveness of those filters, like the quality of the filtration and the flow rates, are things that are like really easy to measure in a home laboratory. And you just need to find suitable plants to start assessing how well they function, how easy they are to grow, put together genetic diversity, and then start selecting for plants that are really good at doing that. And it's interesting because a good example of a high density, in inverted commas, successful pre-industrial agricultural civilization, Southeast China, their main limiting ingredient for their economy was firewood, because they had so much rice that they cut down all of the trees. There were so many people being fed by so much rice that they cut down all the trees, and there was nothing left to like cook the rice with. And a lot of that firewood was used to turn their polluted water into something that was suitable to drink without, dying of diarrhea. So if you could do that purification without having to burn the wood, that would be amazing. So yeah, add that to the list of things that somebody has to do. Get on it, people. Yeah, I love that. How do we domesticate wolves into dogs? Yeah, so I talk about this in the book. Nobody really knew, but then a guy in Russia on a fox fur farm managed to do it in 5 generations. So I think it took him like 10 to 12 years to transform these foxes from animals that were, throwing themselves against the cage, trying to get away every time they saw a human, to ones that like jumped up and licked you and rolled around like a puppy. And all he had to do was to consistently select I think it was the 10 or 5% of pups which had the weakest startle response when a human reached towards them. Simple as that. So I suspect something similar to that happened with wolves, that probably orphaned pups were kept by humans, and the pups that were the most reluctant to either run away from the humans instinctively or to react aggressively to the humans if they had at least got over their fears to them and ended up being culled because they were too dangerous. They were the ones that ended up with the most opportunity to start breeding in association with the humans, and yeah, it wouldn't have taken very long to get them up to dog status. Hybridization seems to have been part of this as well. I'm trying to track down a guest to talk about this in more detail, but yeah, there's messy evidence about dog domestication, but there's a good chance that it happened at least twice, and then the utility of dogs really took off when those two early domesticated populations collided with each other and hybridized. And it's the same pattern we see for almost any animal and plant that we have good data for. Is there any plant you actually hate, or are all plants just misunderstood? Ooh, hating. It isn't the entire genus that I hate, but modern tulips give me the creeps. When I was living in Canberra, I went to Floriade. It's this big festival where they get industrially farmed tulip bulbs and they mass plant them into like all of these like gaudy patterns, and people go there and like take photos, and it's weird. I love the rubberiness of cannas, but there's something different about the texture of hybrid tulips that is just deeply unnerving when I touch them. They're just so, I don't know, they just seem like really miserable plants, that the way that they've been bred and selected has squeezed the joy of living out of them, and they just want to die. and they can't because we won't let them, because we just like these colored blobs on sticks for some reason. And the reason why I don't hate the whole genus. While I was in Canberra, I grew species tulips, like the original wild accessions, and they have the most beautiful flowers. Like the patterning is intricate and complicated, and a window into the minds of the bees that pollinate them out in the mountains of Turkey and Iran, where they come from. And they're unassuming, and I don't know, the feeling you get from these wild species tulips is completely different, and it just makes me sad what the most highly hybridized ones have been turned into. So yeah, not hate. I think it's just pity for what we've done to them. Kind of like teacup poodles or chihuahuas with their eyes like barely attached to their skull anymore. Oh, is nature balanced or unbalanced, and is it ultimately fair about it? So there's an important point that the idea of equilibrium is derived from chemistry, where you are studying closed systems where there's no longer any net change. So it's the definition of a dead system. There's no more useful energy that can be extracted. There's no flow. There's no dynamics. There's no chaos. If you're talking about balance in terms of equilibrium, like there's some natural set point that the complex ecosystem will end up at if you don't, do evil human things and disturb it, or, natural disturbances like, volcanoes going off. I don't think that maps to the idea of balance. I think there are biophysical tendencies which crop up repeatedly because, biology is downstream from chemistry and physics. But the planet that is alive is essentially an open system. There's always energy flowing into it from various different levels, and there's always matter flowing into any subsection. And even planet Earth is like constantly accumulating a decent tonnage of like micrometeorites hits the planet every day. So it's not even a materially closed system, even if you acknowledge that energy is always coming in and out. So yeah, it is by nature unbalanced. You can kind of view it like a huge complex computer that is running through a program where the only way to figure out what happens next is just to run the entire thing. There's no way of reducing it to something simpler. Is it fair about balance? Fair. Fairness is a really ancient social primate instinct. And if you haven't seen it, there's a really beautiful, charming video and funny video about this, where they were training capuchin monkeys, these little tiny arboreal monkeys, to do a job. Like they had to get the researcher a little rock, a pebble, a token, and in return they would get a treat. So like they'll have a reason for doing this. And that's a simple enough kind of train. Monkeys are smart. It's not a hard thing for them to do. The interesting part of this experiment is that they put two monkeys in cages side by side that could see this process. They could see the other monkey working. And monkeys really, really love sweet things to eat. But if they have no other alternative, they will do this little task in return for a low sugar treat, like a piece of cucumber. But if you have two monkeys side by side doing this job, and you give one of them cucumber and the other one something sweet like a grape, the monkey that gets the cucumber knows that its other monkey is getting a better reward for doing the exact same thing, and it feels a sense of injustice. And it gets really, really angry at the human lab researcher demanding that it gets a grape, because it knows the grapes are there. It knows that grapes are exchanged in principle for this job. Just for some baffling reason, it's not getting the reward that the other monkey is getting. And yeah, I think fairness is a primate habit that we've inherited from our deep ancestors. And it's a useful habit if you live in a superorganism. But you also see hierarchies for access to resources in primates to varying degrees. And I think that is also a useful counter resource, because it means if you hit resource limits, you don't have all of the members of the superorganism starve exactly on the same day. There's a disposable edge to that social network that is sacrificed so that at least some of the monkeys can survive and potentially recover the superorganism when resources become more abundant again. So yeah, it's a tricky aspect of human psychology that we have those counterbalancing forces. We have an instinct for equality, but we also understand how effective hierarchies can be when you are facing limits. Okay, that is all of the questions. That took a bit longer than I expected, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I just want to thank everyone who's listened up to this point. You have kept me going through what has been a very busy first year and a very steep learning curve, but I'm thrilled to keep doing this and bringing you the most amazing people from all around the world who are tinkering on this very serious problem that is facing all of us. So stay subscribed, like, share, and keep an eye out for Recombination Nation, which will be launching again in November. The Zero Input Agriculture podcast is a solo passion project built with my ample time and meagre resources. If you would like to support the show, then sign up for a paid subscription to my Zero Input Agriculture blog at Substack. As a reward, you can read all my past posts and listen to the audiobook of Taming the Apocalypse. If you prefer reading about the past and future of biological technology, you can read the ebook of Taming the Apocalypse through Amazon. And finally, please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you use, since it helps other people find me. Or recommend the show directly to anyone who could use some inspiration to become a plant breeder themselves.